Welcome back to Powerhouse San Pedro and back to the book of Revelation. So what we're going to do is, instead of trying to figure out what does this book of Revelation mean for us today, what we're going to do is we're going to take another approach to this book, as I mentioned last week, by learning what the message was for the readers of Revelation in the first century. And that's our focus. So we're going to start with answering questions such as, what is the book of Revelation? What is it meant for? What is its purpose? What did it come to be? How did it come to be? What are the reasons? And as we looked at last week, the first couple of verses of this book will help us answer those questions. The author of this book is John. And John is famous for revealing things, just as we've already seen in the book of John that we went through. So keep this in mind, that we are still laying a groundwork. Why are we still laying a groundwork? The broader the ground covering or the foundation, the more we can place on that foundation. So we're still doing that today as well as we did last week. This class is not a shortcut to the answers, because having all the answers doesn't mean that you know how to decipher the rest of the book. So bear with me as we move steadily to set up a strong, comprehensive foundation so that we can use that to interpret the whole book of Revelation. So we're going to start off with verse 1 and 2. And I'm reading from the new, this one is the New American Standard Version. It says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must soon take place, and he sent and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John, who testified to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Even to all that he saw." So, if you want to understand a statement, you start at the beginning, and that's what we're doing, because there's so much there. These are the verses that are usually just passed over, but there's so much in the beginning. So, to understand a statement, you read it from the beginning. And the very first words of this book provide a very clear characterization of what's inside it. And John tells us right off the bat that this book is a revelation of Jesus Christ. And it also tells us what the purpose is. God is going to reveal and uncover something. And the purpose is to show to his bondservant what must soon take place. So it's about unveiling the Messiah, and it's about what is going to happen soon. Those are the two primary focuses that John is laying out here. So the introduction also reveals how this letter is to be delivered, and it's being delivered by an angel. It says that he, God, testified and communicated by his angel. So the message came from God through his angel to his bondservant John. So now this opening might seem like nothing special to most modern readers. However, John's letter begins like many other apocalyptic Israelite writings of that period. Revelation, the book of Revelation, fits very well into the ancient Jewish literature of that time, because it looks like, it sounds like, and it shares very similar thoughts using the same terminology as other writings during that period. So one apocalyptic writing that shares a similarity, and I mentioned that we're going to look into other writings. We're going to start off with looking into the book of Enoch. Now, the book of Enoch, the reason why we're going to these other books and these other writings is because this is what the first century readers knew. So they knew, this is their grounding. This is why the book of Revelation was not a mystery to them because it spoke the language, the cultural language, and that means it was the things that they knew. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at those things that they read and that they knew. One of those is the book of Enoch. Now, the book of Enoch, and there's other ones, other writings. For example, look at our period now in the 21st century. How many Christian authors do we have today? Just take a guess. Thousands? Okay. So in ancient times, there were other writers as well. It wasn't just the biblical writers. There were other writers, just as there's other writers, Christian writers, godly writers. There was godly writers of that time too. Not all of the ancient writers or the authors made it into the Holy Scriptures. Now, the Bible calls that the canon. The canon are the books that actually made it into the Bible. Now, the reason they call it canon, because canon means a standard of measurement. And it was a high standard of measurement. So in order for a book to get into the Holy Scriptures, it had to go through a lot. It had to line up with this and that. It had to be, there was so much criteria that had to be set up. It had to be written by a prophet, it had to be written or an apostle. It had to gel with everybody. It had to line up. It couldn't contradict it. There were so many things, and not many, as you can tell, not many books made it in. Some of the books were good, but then they weren't true towards the end, or they embellished and so all those books didn't make it. So the ones that made it were very selected, and that's why no one has ever been able to disprove the Bible. There are no contradictions. And they look through that. So we're going to look at other writings, and you may have heard in history of different writings. The Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of they show up every once in a while. Gospel of Thomas is one that you hear, but there's so untrue things in there that don't line up, that kind of contradict. So that would have never made it. It doesn't mean that it was all wrong, though. You see what I mean? So what we're going to do is we're not just going to look at writings that are that made the canon, made the Holy Scriptures. We're going to look at the writings that all of the first century readers would have known, and so that's why we're doing this. Now, there's certain books in the New Testament that even quote from non-biblical writers. The book of Jude is said to have quoted from the book of Enoch. And it's Jude 1:14-15, and this is what it says in Jude. It was also about these men that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." So since Jude used this, does that mean that the book of Enoch is inspired and should be included in the Bible, in the canon scriptures? No, not at all. Just because Jude quotes from the book of Enoch doesn't mean that the entire book of Enoch is inspired or even true. All it means is that that particular verse is true. So he uses it. The book of Enoch was not written by Enoch that we think of, like Noah's great-grandfather, He walked and he was, this is not the Enoch. That was a long time. It also was not the Enoch of Cain's son, Enoch. It wasn't that. Enoch is a common name. So it's not common for us, so we only think of one Enoch. But there are many Enochs. The book of Enoch was written somewhere between 3 BC or BCE and 1 AD or CE. And if you can remember how the time periods went, it went big numbers all the way down to 1. So the 1 BC or BCE I say BCE because that's the modern terminology, before Common Era. That's what BCE stands for. But then it goes to 1 AD or 1 CE, Common Era. So it crosses over. So you have 1 BCE and 1 CE right next to each other. It's 1. Or used to know 1 BC is right next to 1 AD. And then it goes on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the book of Enoch was written somewhere between 3 BC or BCE and 1 AD, the first century, which is where Revelation and the New Testament was mostly written in the first century. And then that's first Enoch. Second Enoch was written in the first century. Third Enoch was written somewhere between 3rd and the 5th century by a rabbi. So the opening verses of the book of Enoch are very similar to John's opening to the book of Revelation. In the beginning of the book of Enoch, he tells us what the book is. Then he says who the recipients are. He says the elect and the righteous who exist in a time of trouble. So essentially, those who are going to go through the persecution that are the righteous people. And then he tells of the mode of how this comes to the author. It says in Enoch, it says, Enoch, a righteous man, saw holy visions from heaven. And he tells us what was the means of that communication. So it kind of sounds familiar to John, to Revelation, because Enoch and John sound familiar in the same way, except Enoch was written hundreds of years before John wrote the book of Revelation. So let me read to you the first 3 verses from the book of First Enoch, okay? So you can hear. This is what it says. The words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and the godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angel showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw. But not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come. Concerning the elect, I said, and took up my parable concerning them. So, in this opening, we see some of the similarities. But one of the things is Enoch says that these visions will not take place in that generation. Enoch says that his writings are for the generations to follow, which is interesting. So that is the opposite of what John is. But they have similar kinds of, he had a vision, saw from angels, and kind of a similar. So John tells us that the things of Revelation will take place soon. And that's John's emphasis. So since Enoch's writings were, since Enoch's writings were written hundreds of years before John, could it have meant that it might have happened in John's generation then? I don't know. Our point is to see the similarities of the writings of the first century readers, of what they would have known. There's other apocalyptic texts from the same era, the third Baruch, and there's fragments that are found. And the reason why I bring these up is to show you the same movement and introduction that we read in John's book of Revelation. And there are many, many more texts that were written in the latter BCE to the early CE, that the first century readers would have known and read about. So if you want to understand the full meanings of where the book of Revelation is wanting to take you, we have to look at its Jewish context and include the other writings that they would have known. And I'll show you an example. It's better to do that than to just look at Revelations through the commentaries of the people ages and ages later in the 20th and 21st century, because they had no idea about the world back then, but more through the works of the first century contemporaries. And that's what we will look at. So the book of Revelation fits well with the other apocalyptic writings, and that it's so Jewish too, that it boggles the minds of some of the scholars, the Jewish scholars, because they can't understand how the book of Revelation can be so Jewish and yet include Jesus. And so some of them have thought that maybe the followers of Jesus later on put it in because it's so Jewish. How can you? But there's no evidence of that theory at all. So some of the things to consider. All the animals mentioned in the book of Revelation are meant to represent humans. Remember that. All the animals mentioned in the book of Revelation are meant to represent humans. The first book of Enoch, even, the seer who sees these visions falls asleep, and he sees a dream based on a very similar flow of Israel's history. By listening to that dream, you would have no trouble picturing that he's talking about the history of Israel. Now, in the book of Enoch, the actors in his dreams are not people, but they're animals. And so he paints the entire picture of Israel using animals. So all the great leaders and kings of Israel are depicted as rams in the book of Enoch. The leaders of Israel are also called shepherds of the sheep. And there's this whole language of rams and lambs and sheeps. And he refers to God as the Lord of the sheep. So, and here's what I mean. Here's 1 Enoch 90:20, just this one verse. It says, "And I saw till a throne was erected in the pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep." Now, the Lord of the sheep is God. "And the Lord of the sheep sat himself thereon, and the other took the sealed books and opened those books before the Lord of the sheep." It kind of sounds familiar. I don't know, from last week, if you remember, because if you read Revelation, you probably have run into sheep who are worthy, a sheep who is worthy, the lamb who is worthy to open the scroll. And he's the only one who is worthy. And so Enoch's vision sounds familiar. It's a lot like what we read, I think it was in Revelation 5 of last week. But in Enoch here, it says the other open. In the vision of Enoch, it is the other next to the Lord of the sheep, next to God. There's the Lord of the sheep, God, and then there's this other one who opens the sealed scrolls. Now, in Revelation, there's a very unusual looking lamb that we talked about last week. You remember that lamb with 7 eyes, 7 horns? A lamb who was slain is the only one worthy to open the scroll with 7 seals and has 7 horns and 7 eyes. So the lamb represents someone. And the reader is supposed to guess the identity of the lamb. That's what they're doing. They want the readers to guess. They want the readers that are reading, they want you to guess because it represents somebody. So you see how that works? They don't just say it out, but they'll say it and they want you to guess who that someone is. They want you to guess who is the one who has 7 horns and 7 eyes and this lamb. So those who understand this type of language will have no trouble guessing the identity of the lamb with the 7 horns, a lamb that was slain. Those who do not understand this kind of language will continue to wonder. And to them, it will remain an obscure vision of a lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. And you see, and so to them, it doesn't make sense. But to the insider, they see who it is. And they learn to identify who, because all animals represent humans. Does that make sense? So this is what I mean when I said that this book was written with the insider in mind. Those who are supposed to understand will understand, because it speaks a very cultural language of the books of the apocalypse. So here in First Enoch, it helps us to see, because he paints the same exact imagery as John does. And so I'm going to read some more of Enoch. This is First Enoch, and you could just look online. The book of Enoch is open to the public. You can go online and if you want to look at the book of Enoch. So the first Enoch 90 verse 37 to 40 says, and I saw that and let me tell you why I'm reading this, because this is what the first century people would have known. These are the readings that they have read. And so they know this well. It says, verse 37, and I saw that a white bull was born with large horns. Okay, remember, the readers needs to guess. And I saw till all their generations were transformed, and they all became white bulls, and the first among them became a lamb. So you have these white bulls, and then from the white bulls becomes a lamb. So first the bulls were born, and out of the white bull came a lamb. And then it goes on to say, and that lamb became a great animal, and had great black horns on its head, and the Lord of the sheep, God, rejoiced over it. So whatever their lamb is that came out of the bulls brought lots of happiness to the Lord of the sheep, to God. And then it goes on to say, and all that happiness all over all of the oxen. And then it says, and I slept in their midst, and I awoke and saw everything. This is the vision which I saw while I slept. So these are the kind of writings that Enoch, these are the kind of, so you know that when they read Revelation, they were already used to this. They were already used to figuring out what the symbols mean, the cultural images of animals and people. Now, the context of John's visions in Revelation and the symbols he uses are very familiar to the Jewish audience because of these kinds of writings. This was not something that was unknown to them. So when they're reading the book of Revelation and they're talking about the Lamb, they are used to that. They've already seen Enoch. They see how that it is very common that animals represent humans and humans represent animals. For us, that's not common. So okay, so keep that in mind. Very common. So, and also remember that the first century readers were used to reading all these writers and all these scrolls. We're not. See, we're used to TV, movies, video games, internet. But they weren't used to those. They didn't have those things. What did they have? Writings. That was their entertainment. That was their everything. So when you look at all these writings and you think, oh, how are we going to catch up all that writings? I barely can read the Bible. In their time, this was their TV. This was their entertainment. This is the stories, the writers, the history. This is a very common thing. So that's why they understood all the cultural things and the writings of other people before they read the book of Revelation. So John's techniques belong to the genre of the apocalyptic books, many of which emerged from the time period of the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. The Jewish apocalyptic books existed in that slice of history. So the first century is where John was writing the book of Revelation. Apocalyptic books, the apocalyptic books use images, symbols, cultural and linguistic codes. And all this makes perfect sense to the insider, but is usually meaningless to the outsider. And that brings us to the image of the beast. And its number is a perfect example of all this that we've been talking about. Most of us are familiar with the beast, right? And the mark of the beast, right? There's a mystery to that, but not as much as you think. Revelation 13:15-18 says this: "And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as to not worship the image of the beast to be killed." So pause for a second. So those who don't worship the image of the beast dies. That's what that's saying. So verse 16. "And he causes all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free men and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. Dun, dun, dun. Now, remember the apocalyptic tradition of animals being represented as people. People being animals, animals being people. The beast is just an animal, right? And so it represents a human being. And the number of who that is, and the reader is supposed to calculate this. The number is 666. That's the number of the name of this human, right? Because a beast is a human. And that system of calculating, it's called a gematria. That's the system. It's a numeric code system. It's not a foreign thing. It's something that many people use. It's meant to help people calculate and identify who John is writing about. So we got the mark of the beast. So let's hold that for a second. We're going to come back. Remember what I said about the insiders know how to do that. The outsiders do not. So as the mark of the beast, whatever shape or form it was to take, it was to be placed on the head and on the hand, according to Revelation. And the beast himself, his number is meant to be calculated. The book of John tells us that whoever has wisdom and understanding can figure this out. And that John says that in his book, in his gospel, they can calculate who the beast is. And then the mark is to be placed on people's head. You see, when the Jewish audience read this, of where this is to be placed on their head or on their hand, when they hear this placement of the mark, it's very familiar to them. And it would actually make perfect symbolic sense. Maybe to a non-Jew audience, it wouldn't, though, of where the mark is said to be placed on the head or the hand. But to a Jewish audience, this would be very familiar. And here is what would come to mind. This is a traditional Jewish practice. And one of the daily passages recited devotionally by Jewish people in ancient times, traditionally Israelites were commanded to place God's word on themselves. And the scriptures say specifically to bind them as a sign on your hand and to wear them as frontals on your forehead. Have you ever heard of that? You look up pictures and they put the word there. Or it says, or between your eyes. And this comes from Deuteronomy 6:8 that says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. So this was not unusual. In the Jewish communities, these verses are practiced by them wearing, it's called phylacteries or tefillin. These are two names for this. And this is all a common practice during their morning prayers. A tefillin is two small boxes containing portions of Torah text. And it's placed on the head and on the arm and attached with leather straps, and people would wrap themselves in God's word and pray. This was a common practice. This is a common practice for many of them still. But back then, it was a very common practice. They literally wore God's word. And it makes God's ways a tangible part of their life. So the mark of the beast would also show a sign of loyalty. Since the tefillin shows a sign of loyalty to God, as will the mark of the beast will show loyalty to the beast. And that's the idea. The beast has his ways and God of Israel has his ways. And that type of placing a symbol or an image on the hand or the head to a Jewish person would sound very familiar. That's not odd. That they would, it's something they practice every day in prayer. To us, it's strange. Mark on the head? In the hand? That's unusual. Because our scriptures are on our shelf. Right? In the car, in the trunk. Or there's one on our nightstand. There's one on our table. There's one on the shelf. There's one in the car, right? That's common. See, but what was common for the Jewish reader is to place the God's word on their head and on their hand and strap to it. So as you're looking at this text, this is, for the first century reader, this is very common. Now let's get back to the beast. I was going to give you and pass out a picture of a bust of a man named Nero Caesar. Nero was at that time the emperor of the Roman Empire. He was a very evil man. Nero Caesar is his name, which in Hebrew is pronounced Neron Caesar. So when you add up, using the gematria, when you add up the letters and the numbers of his name, it adds up to 666. In Hebrew, letters are numbers, numbers are letters. So each letter has a numeric value. So if you take the letters as numbers and add them together in his name, you will get 666. Now, people have argued that there are other historical people whose name adds up to 666 as well. And that may be true. But I want to show you something that's very unique about this evil ruler, Nero Caesar. I don't know if you've ever heard, but in some interpretations of the Bible, that verse that I read, Revelation 13:18, where it talks about the number 666, in some translations, it says 616 and not 666. Anybody ever heard that? Okay, there's other translations that say 666 and then others that say 616. The reason is because there was found some of the earliest fragments of papyrus manuscripts that were found. On these manuscripts, they were from the 3rd century. And those 3rd century Greek manuscripts showed the number in Revelation 13:18 to be 616 and not 666. And so that caused a lot of like, whoa. And so there are some translations that say 616, and most of our translations say 666. So there's some in verse. So what's up with that? Why is that? The reason is this. The number was adjusted by the scribes to line up with the Latin spelling of Nero's name. because they knew who the beast was. Nero Caesar is how you spell it in Latin. In Hebrew, it's spelled Neron Caesar. And if you notice in the Hebrew, there's an added letter. So in Hebrew, it adds up to 666, 666. But his name in Latin adds up to 616. So some of the ancient manuscripts have it in Latin style and some in Hebrew style. So probably because not many people knew the Hebrew language after a while, and then it was to Latin. So the scribes, they decided to readjust it because the language changed. So in the Latin, which came, they tallied up because they knew who the mark was. They knew who the beast was. They knew it was Nero. So it's clear as to who this is talking about, Nero Caesar or Neron Caesar, to see how evil this man is. You could look him up. Look up Nero. Look up the history. You can see how evil this man. So the scribes adjusted that. So by that point, probably fewer and fewer people knew Hebrew and more knew Latin. So it was adjusted. Either way, it makes a strong case for Nero being the guy in both cases. Nero as the beast. Because we have the code system, the gematria, in two languages confirming the same person. Now, that would not happen with everyone else. Jews were not the only ones using numbers to represent letters to spell out names that they wanted concealed. This was a common thing that people did. This coding, especially this gematria. In the city of Pompeii, Italy, that was destroyed by a volcanic eruption in 79 AD or CE, archaeologists uncovered a curious inscription, and this is what the inscription said: "I love her whose number is 545. So some lover decided to proclaim affection publicly, but encoded the name numerically, just like in Revelation. Maybe it was a forbidden love or an affair or something. What the people involved in this relationship would have known the meaning of 545, but others would be left guessing, since technically many names could add up to that number. So Nero makes it into the book of Revelation by the gematria code. And we know that all the persecution of this evil man destroyed the Israelites, erased, for the most part, the Jewish people. I've read writings of what Nero, how he tortured and how he killed. And so it becomes very clear here that he's the man that is represented and called the beast. So with that concludes this portion of this class. And so I'll see you next class, and we'll do some more.